the science and the approach to how we're going to expand on some concepts that are relatively new, but some concepts that we've also got lots of evidence to look at this afternoon that shows how you can build strength in a network, something that perhaps we've all done over the years informally, but now we can put some real theory and science behind it. So the way we've organised the session is with two presentations, Pedro Delgado and Annette Bartley are going to do the first session and then take questions. And then we have a second session from the University of Leicester with Mary and Graham. I think Graham's going to do the presentation and we'll take their questions at the end of that second session. And I think you'll find that there's complementary stuff as well as perhaps some challenges for us to think about during the next 90 minutes. So without further ado, we'll start the first presentation.
Thanks, Tricia. Can people hear okay? Are these microphones on? Yeah. Okay. So, Annette, you'll introduce yourself when you come up? Yeah. So I'm Pedro Delgado. I'm an executive director at Ihi, and I have to make a confession. I fear, at least in our presentation, that we may not be telling you a lot that's extremely new because you're all experts at networks, right? You're all probably trying to build a network that's thriving, that's sustainable, that makes a difference, that achieves results. You're trying to take it in a certain direction, and I think in the transition of thinking about networks as something that was out there through to trying to control or stop ourselves from controlling them, there's a lot of reflection and self-awareness that I think we need to make, and there are a lot of tools out there. You will hear from Graham after us about an actual study of a number of networks. So our reflections will be experiential. We have the community manager from the Open School who manages a community spread through more than 50 countries and throughout hundreds of chapters. We have Annette who lived the day in and day out of the Safer Patients Network in the UK. So this will be very experiential. So let me just reiterate the objectives that you are already familiar with. We'll describe a bit of theory from an angle that we picked. There is a lot of network theory out there. Describe the application of networks in healthcare, and then just reflect with you on some of the things that we learned. So the case study will be the Safer Patients Network, and the second one will be the Ihi Open School. Our lens and the reason why we're keen, interested, and passionate about networks is we're trying to, as our mission statement reads, improve quality and safety worldwide. And we do it through a number of avenues. We have results-focused initiatives, so we do time-bound collaboratives where we bring clinical and managerial teams together to achieve a certain aim. And that's a network in and of itself as it builds. We provide learning opportunities, so we have communities that we connect over a fixed period of time, which is short, a day, a month, a year, a week, and then we build a community that continues to come to those courses over time, so we keep them connected. We produce knowledge that we share widely, and that creates a sense of affinity. And then we have connecting platforms. This is a connecting platform that we have, for instance, the International Forum. We have a national forum in the US in December, and we're doing a forum in Latin America in June, one in New Zealand in September. So we try to provide platforms so that people like you who are leading improvement efforts can communicate and talk. So we want to get better all the time at connecting people deeply, meaningfully, and usefully. I think value add in networks is probably the biggest question for us. So in terms of the context, you've heard it in every presentation, I think, at least in some of the plenaries, about the gaps that still exist. So how do we hasten the pace and scale of improvement? We know, you know, people, organizations and communities who are doing incredible things. How do we find them? How do we reach everyone? How do we disseminate through our networks, your networks, what's happening, and make it very consumable? And we know that no one can close gaps on their own, so how do we work together in a way that's meaningful? So let me share with you a couple of thoughts in relation to theory. And one of them is actually a product of one of our 90-day R&D cycles. And I'd love your reflections on it, and would be very happy to share the internal paper. Networks are everywhere, as I said, and the definitions of networks are many. This is a frame that we're choosing to use, and in fact, the title of our talk, "Not Everything That Connects is a Network," proposes is an article that proposes this four-item structure. When you're thinking about networks, perhaps diagnosing it. So, when you think about your network, what is the purpose of the network? Why does it actually exist? What's the role of the network? How does it promote value amongst members? What is the function of it? What does it do? How does it build community? How does it share knowledge? How does it convene stakeholders, if it does? And what is the form? What's the structural and organizational characteristics of the network? What's the governance? How tight, loose? How free the entry is or not. So you'll see differences. We've used this very simple framework to start the reflection of the two networks that we're showing you. And then there's this, which is the result of our 90-day R&D cycle based on theory that I'm sure you're familiar with. And in the purest sense of a driver diagram, we don't think about it sequentially. So you don't start from the top and then take the other items to think about how they intertwine or work together. But you take each element and understand how it contributes to the big game. We disrespected that in terms of this, and I think there is a clear first step in a potential sequence here, which is diagnosing the network, and that can take on many forms in relation to a map, which can be quite sophisticated mathematically and intellectually and so on, and it depends on how you frame questions to get that map of a network. And after doing that, you identify strong and weak ties, and you could maybe use strong ties for influence, for innovation, and for as opinion leaders. And this is commonsensical. And some of the weak ties you can use to perhaps bridge silos and bring outside ideas into the network and to disseminate best practice. They don't need to be central nor be connected strongly, but you can use them as vehicles for dissemination. In terms of managing the network center, and again, the analysis doesn't need to be sophisticated. Most of you who do networks, who manage networks, who facilitate networks probably know where the center is. So you could utilize strategies to retention-based strategies where you allocate a bit of an additional benefit, or you provide a development opportunity for those people so that they can continue driving the energy of the network. You can use it if you identify some of the hidden stars that are central to that network as a way of succession planning. If your leadership structure is not aligned with the centrality of your network, so the people that are highly connected are not necessarily the people who are in the position of hierarchy in the organization, but they have potential, you can do it in a very intentional way. Leveraging the network's periphery talks about perhaps newcomers, people that are coming new and who are peripheral to the network, and how you bring them in or induct them into the network, or whether you just abandon them and let them get in and find their way. And perhaps people who were high performance, who you didn't take the time or the analytical thought to study where they were, and you didn't nurture them, and they started drifting away. So how do you bring them back into the network from the periphery where they are right now? And then altering the networks through connections or contagions, the connections, the weak and loose, perhaps making them stronger intentionally through events, through electronic communications, and so on. And contagion, how do you craft themes of interest, for instance, who may be able to create a contagion effect amongst a certain group that you may be interested in. So this was an internal piece of work by Marion Burl, and we're again editing the document so that it could be of public consumption. We used it to reflect on our networks and how we treat them, how careful we are at knowing where things are, how to actually alter it, and how to enhance it. And we know and understand that connections matter, and they matter a lot. This is from Nicholas Christakis, and carbon's the element that's a common denominator in these two things. But when you think about value, at least perceived, of a pencil and a diamond, it's quite different. And the difference lies, in this case, in the way that that the atoms connect internally in the two. So connections do matter. In terms of diagnosing the network, I spoke before about mapping a network, and the applications of this, I think, can be incredibly powerful. In fact, the first slide that we had there is from a real study from Nicholas Christakis of a large population and how they connected, and how obesity has a number of degrees of separation in terms of how it can be part of a community and so on. I think the impact of this can be big, and we just did a small prototype with one of our communities within IHI and identify and drew some conclusions. I can't tell you what it is. The circles are related to geography, and we were able to draw a few lessons from just mapping a network in a more scientific way. And we're still evaluating whether what you need to invest in actually getting a map of this nature done is outweighs an analysis that may not require that level of mathematical sophistication or computer software. So let me swiftly move into the case studies so that we can reflect, perhaps using the lens that we've just talked about on a couple of case studies. And Annette's going to take the first one, which is the Safer Patients Network, and I'm going to talk about the second one with the knowledge that Jessica Perlo, who manages this global network, is here, so some of those questions may be addressed to me and to her. So we leave time for questions at the end, Tricia, right? Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I think I'll lead you in a chorus of La Mer. Yeah? But that was interesting this morning. Helen created a connection, and I think one of the most important things around networks is creating connections between people. So my name's Annette Bartley. Pardon the pun. You can't have a network without Annette. Yeah? You like that? Okay. And I had the privilege of being involved in the last 3 years in an excellent, exciting and innovative project which was about developing a network in patient safety. It was sponsored by the Health Foundation. IHI were actually the providers, and I was actually the programme director. Now, I don't stand up here and profess to be an expert in networks. What I want to do is share my real-world experience, because it can be challenging. So hopefully I can't condense 3 years learning into 15 minutes and 15 slides, but I'll do my best to give you some of the key messages. So first of all, let me begin talking about the background to the network. It was launched in June 2009. It involved 18 NHS organisations, and they were scattered across the UK. So we had Scotland, Northern Ireland, I'm doing this, but they could be in other directions, Scotland, Northern Ireland, England, and my homeland of Wales. Okay. The organisations were unique in the fact that they'd all been involved in an initiative called the Safer Patients Initiative. Now, how many of you have heard of the Safer Patients Initiative? Okay, so quite a lot of you. So that was actually a groundbreaking programme, again supported by the Health Foundation, that actually changed the face of patient safety in the UK and spearheaded an awful lot of national programmes. Now, these organisations were the pioneers. They were involved in the two phases, Phase 1 and Phase 2. And what was apparent at the end of that, their experience in their different phases, was that these organisations wanted to remain connected to each other. They'd built up a community, they'd shared goals, they'd sought after patient outcomes, improving patient outcomes together, and they wanted to stay connected. So the Health Foundation very kindly supported the infrastructure to develop a network. So if we look at Pedro's framing, the purpose was really to strengthen and sustain the impact of the Safer Patients Initiative in those 18 organisations. The role was about interaction, about sharing results, coming up with solutions, being able to contact each other and build that community, continue to build that community. The function, again, community building, sharing knowledge, coaching. We used some collaboratives, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and some innovation methods, which were very interesting. And about convening stakeholders. And in terms of form, the Health Foundation were obviously there supporting the whole framework as governors, and IHI as the technical provider. So that's a bit about the background. Now, the actual structure of the 3-year programme was designed around these particular pillars. The first one is about developing this learning community. actually getting people to not just achieve the goals that they try to strive to achieve within the Safer Patients Initiative, but seeking beyond that, stretching further to improve safety even more. The next strand was about innovation, and many of you will be familiar with IHI's R&D, 90-day projects, correct? Yeah? Hands? Some of you? Again, I'll talk about that in a moment. We also designed a collaborative called the Pass It On Collaborative. Now, this was a virtual program where we actually coached organisations within the network to coach other organisations within the network to get results. So we actually identified some organisations who'd managed to get results around patient safety topics. And in turn, virtually, they taught another 6 to 8 organisations around that specific topic. So it was kind of a coaching the coaches approach. And the interesting thing about that was it was done virtually. So the challenges of virtual learning and virtual coaching, was something that we experienced and lived. And ultimately, the idea was to develop a self-sustaining, member-led community. And that was the real challenge. Over time, membership grew from just the core key contacts, which were 25 in number at the very beginning, and more recently it hit the 500 mark. So it was slow growing, and the challenge was that we were connecting organisations. Now, often what we found was that one individual would come to all of the activities that we had to represent their organisation. So they were the connector, and their role was really important. Now, if they kept that knowledge to themselves, that knowledge didn't disperse throughout their organisation. So the importance of having the right individuals in those core key positions was really paramount. And we learned through the 3 years that sometimes the people that we thought were the connectors were actually the blockage, because they'd keep that information, but it wouldn't be disseminated. Or they wouldn't actually encourage other people to come into the network. So I think if you're thinking about setting up networks, the connector, that individual who seems passionate and really wants to be there, can sometimes, when you look beyond the surface, can be that blockage in the system. So it's quite important to know that. Now, at the time we began, there was some evidence out there about healthcare, networks in healthcare, but it was quite sparse. So we had to go into it quite sort of carefully. But we knew that you had to have crisp aims and priorities, that there had to be a shared optimism, the opportunity to do something remarkable together, to keep connected. There had to be something that drew people magnetically to it. We also knew that we had to be creative and opportunistic. That virtual networks are challenging. A lot of people like to see faces. Would you agree? If you just heard my voice in this room this afternoon, it wouldn't be quite the same, would it? And this is the challenge that we faced. People were so used to face-to-face events in the Safer Patients Initiative that this was a whole new way of learning, and it was challenging for members. We also knew that it needed to be simple. Too complex and things can run into difficulties. And finally, there had to be a profound respect for logistics that amateurs talk about. In network theory, amateurs talk about strategy, but logistics is really, really important. Now, we had lots and lots of different activities that were designed to try and engage this community. You have to remember that these organisations are very busy NHS organisations doing their day job. So we had to try and attract them to a telephone call and keep them interested, and that's a challenge. We very quickly learned that there had to be face-to-face events, and we actually had our first face-to-face event 1 year after we began. On retrospect, I think it would have been good to start with that face-to-face event and create those connections. Because we'd made the assumption that because people had been part of the Safer Patient Initiative, they knew all about patient safety, they knew what we were at, but what we hadn't realised is that many people had left these organisations. They were a completely new community, so we were having to rebuild and relearn and reteach. We had the virtual collaborative, the Coaching the Coach. We actually had 5 different topics that we looked at around innovation, and I'd be happy to talk in more detail in the question session about those. We had WebEx calls with experts, and one would think we had some fabulous international speakers, and one would think that would be enough to attract people to calls, but even that was a challenge. People would say we really wanted to get there, but it was busy. We couldn't get off the unit, we couldn't leave a meeting, etc., etc. We had leadership calls because the aim was to be a member-led community. We wanted to engage the leaders, but we found the challenge was that leaders were very busy. So we were learning as we went along, and there were lots of different challenges. Now, here was the reality in practice, and I think it's important if you're considering developing a network that you consider the reality in your context. At the time, you know, surveying the political landscape, there were a lot of changes in the NHS. And for those of you that know about the NHS, there's slightly different governance in each of the different nations. So, for example, there was a patient safety campaign in England. There was a different patient safety campaign with different aims in Wales. There was a big programme, the Scottish Patient Safety Programme, that many of you will have heard about in Scotland at the time, and Northern Ireland were doing a different piece of work. So we had 4 different national perspectives, 4 different government settings, and lots of change. So it was trying to build a castle on shifting sands. But that made the challenge more exciting. We also had a lot of financial cutbacks, so that was one of the complexities that we had to deal with. And I think it's really important that you go in looking at these things. The core activities, and I know that Brenda is in the audience here, one of the programme managers from Northern Ireland, and the core activities that we felt really added value for members, and I'm sure, Brenda, you'll agree, would you? With the Pass It On virtual collaborative. Now, this is where we actually coached the teams. So we identified teams who had been successful in 2 topics. One of the topics was reducing pressure ulcers, and the other topic was about reducing peripheral vascular catheter infections. These teams had demonstrated success in their organisations and been able to spread within their organisations. What we were testing is, could we develop them to take that further and take it outside of their own organisations? So there were 6 members in the Pass It On collaborative from across the UK. 6 different organisations took part, and all of those organisations moved their performance significantly. Also, in the peripheral vascular catheter collaborative, there were 3 organisations that participated in that. So this was about actively getting involved, actively measuring together. We had a listserv, and we had a WebEx, a platform where we could actually compare data. So people could actually post their data and it enabled people to see each other's results. The other programme that was particularly successful was the innovation programme. Now, at the time, it was called the R&D programme, but people just they weren't able to disconnect research and development and innovation. So we had a lot of aligning to do in terms of the definition of research and development, because innovation projects are very discrete, 90 days, quick turnaround, no ethical approval required, looking at new topics. So it's very different, and we found that people struggled with that. But even so, there was great value from a member's perspective in that programme. I'm not going to show you all the results. We can actually talk more about that in the question session. But just to give you a glimpse here, this was South Eastern Trust, Brenda's trust, who actually did some work in their innovation programme in care homes. And they actually saw that they actually reduced falls by bringing in interventions that had been previously used in acute setting into primary care. And they actually saw a reduction in falls in their 90-day period. They also saw an increase in the number of days between falls, so that was a great success. If we think about the learning, I came across some learning that John Seeley had done on research into developing online communities, and it kind of had a great sort of matching to the experience that we'd had. And he talked about 4 L's, and we've kind of adapted that to our experience. So if when we developed the network, what we saw were these 4 different L's. The first one was about lurking. There were people who lurked on the edge of the network. They would join the calls, they'd listen. We wouldn't quite know they were there apart from seeing their name on the WebEx, but they'd lurk and they'd listen. The next thing was about linking. So people would call into the expert calls, they'd listen to the Pass It On collaboratives, and they'd start to make connections with each other and also with work that they were doing back in their organisations. The next stage was about a deeper stage of learning, where the innovation teams and the Pass It On collaborative teams really took not just listening, but actually actively learning. And finally, we saw leadership. We saw leaders emerge. Many of the individuals who'd been that core group actually started to lead the program. They led calls. They actually led the development of a driver diagram for the network. They led the development of the measurement plan for the network. So they got actively involved. So that was the range of engagement from teams, from this lurking on the outside to actually leading. And that was quite interesting to follow. If we think about value, here are some of the things that people have talked to us about, what they gained from the network in the last 3 years. It helped them to re-energise and to refocus. They'd been part of this big Safer Patients initiative. They'd gone back to their ranch and they really wanted more energy and the ability to refocus. They felt it was a safe community to ask difficult questions. If they didn't know something, they could find somebody who did. It created connections to work colleagues from other organisations that wouldn't have happened without that framework, that infrastructure. And that created a richer pool of learning. And finally, it provided them with some active challenges around these programmes that I've just described and the chance to influence policy. But what you mustn't underestimate is the need for that personal connection. You know, you can see here it says, "So good to meet you, face-to-face book." People really wanted to meet face-to-face. So I think when we think about developing virtual collaboratives, there has to be some degree of connectivity between individuals. Now, the first 3 years, the first phase of the Safer Patients Network has passed, and as networks evolve, the second phase is about to begin, and the Health Foundation are going to be making an announcement shortly in the next month or so, I believe, about the new phase of the network. But from our perspective, I think there's an incredible amount of learning, and we'll summarise that at the end. Pedro? Thank you. Oh.
So let me tell you this story very briefly. The Ihi Open School was created in 2008, and the intention was to produce knowledge for the world. It grew out of frustration of going to medical schools, to health profession schools, and not finding a home for quality or safety. So there was a decision made at the Institute for Healthcare Improvement to just open an open school, which was free for students worldwide, and it had some interesting content around safety and quality and leadership, which is basic, but it's a way of getting people into the spirit of safety and quality. It's considered as the other school. That was the thought at the time, an educational community that's free and open. There's no application, so bureaucracy is kept to the bare minimum. There's no admission requirements, and there are no due dates. People can take courses at the rhythm that they want, when they want, and where they want. As time passed, they've been accredited in medicine, nursing, and pharmacy in the US. And an interesting reflection on building a network over a network is the courses were in English. Are in English, and we used an existing network in Latin America and the Portuguese-speaking countries of the world to actually get these courses translated, with the only incentive of the recognition economy, where we would put the names of the translators who were quality leaders, either academics or implementers in their countries, into the material. So the purpose of the Open School is to advance healthcare improvement and safety competencies in the next generation. In terms of how that's done, or the role, there's materials, there's fixed courses, connecting opportunities, such as meetings that you may have seen at the forum here and the forum in Orlando, awards, and practicums, which is a way of translating the learning into practice. They do community building calls, they share knowledge widely. And for some of the activities, there's coaching involved, both directly from IHI and internally within each of the chapters that create their own infrastructure to drive improvement. So they have a faculty advisor, they have a student leader, and then they create organically as they deem useful in the local context. IHI hosts a platform. Each chapter is free, and it's the formation of it is just a form to be filled in that's uploaded on the web. And there are regular connecting opportunities, both face-to-face and virtual. It's open to anybody, anywhere in the world. So these are some of the measures of building a network in a much less structured way than the Safer Patients Network, and with activities that have grown partly because of design initiatives internally, and partly because we've learned from the community and listened to what they've found useful. So in 3 years, there's 85,000 students and residents registered. There's about 10,000 faculty and deans registered. 37,000 students and residents have completed an online course. 2,700 have a certificate of completion. And there are 417 chapters in almost every state in the US and in 54 countries. So there is an aim that should be or will be launched soon. Has it been launched yet, Jessica? Yeah, around a course, Quality Improvement 102, we want to have 2 million people take the course in a fixed time period. So it's a network that's loose, that's growing, and that's evolving, but it has its own complications and its own complexity. So there are many sub-networks, local, regional, national, and global. Just to give you a flavor for how that may look like at a national level, the Vice Minister of Mexico launched the Ihi Open School materials into Spanish on the 14th of February this year, and he's building a local infrastructure in Mexico using every public hospital, every academic institution, primarily medicine and nursing linked, and every professional society to at least get them started in the movement. It's a very fluid network. There's very little control. It's open. The quality of the product is what drives what attracts people into it. Measuring how thriving, how effective, how much value add there is in the network-linked activities, both the local network and the global network, is a very difficult thing to do. And it's fed off the desire and the ability of students to do social media and to use social media, so it's present in LinkedIn and in Facebook and in all the social media that's available. So one of the biggest challenges here is they remain as students for a fixed period of time, and then there's a drop-off point where they either finish the courses or graduate from medical school or from nursing school or from pharmacy. And what happens to those people? How or what are we doing to continue to build that army of improvers that we want to see throughout the world? And I'm not sure that we do a great job in following up with their initial enthusiasm and link to the network around safety and quality improvement. So 2 case studies, and we'd love to reflect with you on lessons. I have to confess, I'm keen to take questions or comments. Silence. Is everybody okay? It's right after lunch. Are you still awake? Okay, you're still here. So let me reflect, and these are some personal reflections. Leadership. If we think about network mapping, if we think about the open school model, if we look at some of the experience of a more structured network that Annette talked about, how do we consider leadership, and how do we view leadership differently than just leadership that's given by a job title or by a position in an organization? How do we think about hierarchies in a world where perhaps the people that are most connected are the people that are able to influence a system or to drive a change or an improvement more effectively and efficiently? How do we think about knowledge where we know in the past it was perhaps nested, our ability to share knowledge was perhaps low, and now we have all sorts of medium to share knowledge widely. Knowledge is distributed, it's everywhere, and its availability, it's everywhere. So the number of journals that we have access to, the number of platforms that we have access to has exploded over the last 20 to 30 years. How do we think about people types? Do we continue to use the Myers-Briggs of this world and the optimist, pessimist, and realist, and so on? People types, or do we think about people as connectors, as their position in a network? And how would that influence the way we implement change, the way we think about change, and the way we plan change from a traditional point of view to what network science is providing us with the opportunity to do? And this energy grid thought is linked to to the social network analysis, where there's a possibility of framing whatever question you want to find out the connections around, and then seeing the connection. So you could ask, for instance, all your employees, who do you draw positive energy from, and who drags the life out of you or the energy out of you? And it would be a pretty cool and a pretty interesting thing to do, right? I see a lot of laughter, but you know the guys that that drive the negative energy, and you know the guys that drive the positive energy. So we have fixed ways of looking at the world. We all do. Let me just say this with all the respect and caution that it deserves. In public sector, I don't know if your experience is different, but we have structures where, by virtue, in universities it might be similar, at least in the ones that I know, where being in a job and being in a job for a long time means that you'll escalate positions. And just by virtue of being there and perhaps learning about the system itself means that you'll escalate positions over time. How would that change if we thought about this energy grid? If we could ask people, who do you draw positive and negative energy from? If we looked at hierarchies differently, if we looked at leadership based on connectivity, ability to influence change, and so on. So these are reflections that I'm sure you've considered at some point, and it's just an invitation for us to think together about what the future may look like, at least in relation to the power of network analysis and network science into the things that we do.
Thank you.
Okay, just really to conclude, just a couple of slides to sort of summarise our thinking and our learning. One of the most important things we feel is about value. You know, the network has to create value for its membership. However they do that, that's the key thing. And what we found is that when people contribute to a network, when they play an active role, there's some kind of accumulation. They get something back. They get a lot more back, that reciprocity, and then the accumulation of value. So bear that in mind as you think about developing your networks. And finally, I won't read through all of them, just to pull out the main points. It has to meet the wants and desires of participants and attract. It's got to be attractive. There was something about the Open School that attracted youngsters who were familiar with this Facebook, Twitter, all the kind of innovation technology that attracted them magnetically, and that's key. It's emergent. Networks evolve, they will change. The Safer Patients Network will look very differently in its next phase, and that's okay. It's hosted. There has to be somebody at the centre hosting it, setting aim, setting direction, but in a minimally bureaucratic way. Again, some kind of brand, something that people feel connected to. People often want to feel connected to something bigger than themselves, something that's actually creating value. So to conclude, before we have some questions, networks are certainly no panacea. More often than not, and certainly in my experience, they're complex, messy, dynamic and difficult to manage. However, it's only through engaging healthcare professionals effectively through networks that new integrated models of healthcare are likely to be achieved. So thank you for listening, and we've got a couple of minutes for questions, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Pedro. Annette, 2 or 3 minutes for 2 or 3 questions if people have ones from the floor. Could you walk up to the microphone? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jeff Fuller from Australia. Just a couple of, I guess, responses to your invitation to, I guess, your questions. So I'm going to throw some questions back at you, I suppose. Number one, well, I think they're both different networks, but they're both goal-directed. So does the membership have a sense of itself? So are the members the same, or do they change? So are they stable networks or not? I guess it seems to me the network or the membership does need to have a sense of itself. And so I think, Annette, you indicated that someone needs to be at the hub of sort of manipulating that process to enable the network to have a sense of itself. And it seems to me there's probably 3 things that are important. Legitimacy, do the network members see that it's a valuable thing to be, because that enables commitment, that ability to make the decision about the payoff, benefit and cost, and I suppose tied up with that is purpose. So I guess my global question is, how does the network, the members of the network, work through that sort of stuff?
That's a question. I think part of what you said at the beginning is about being dynamic. So members did move in and out of the network. Sometimes it was because they left positions in their organisation. Sometimes it was because they had other challenges. So there's this element of dynamism. I think you said about legitimacy, that's obviously key. But I think it's value for members. If they're able to shape and influence the network, I think that's makes a huge difference. At the beginning, we actually did that virtually. They actually developed the aims. They actually came up with the framework. And, you know, that was challenging in itself, but I think it did help to keep a core group of individuals connected for the 3 years. And that core group were the people that really stayed connected. So there was clearly accumulation of value for them. Certainly, Pedro, you can probably answer better from the open school perspective. But what I see from the open school is, again, it's where people are actively involved. There's more value. So, you know, these chapters, they develop a life of their own. And they actually, you know, you'll be able to tell more about that, but they actually develop a life of their own. They shape things in the way that they want to run them. But again, there has to be some stability. So I think some central stability, some core dynamic flexibility, and some value, and to make it legitimate.
Just to reflect on your question around managing the network and somebody having to be there, I think the struggle, and I could reflect for both instances, it's one where there's a polarity between direct management and nurturing. I think the job of a network lead is more of a nurturing role, where you see the network and you continue to feed it with.
Just to add to that, I've read some of the text on this, that the network management is about relationship.
Okay, so I'm conscious that we're tight for time and there's questions, so...
One last question? 2 last questions?
My name is Rachel Dennis from North West England. I've got a couple of questions, one for each of you, just to make it fair. Annette, I don't know if you can get back to your slide, and you may well not need to, but the graph that showed the membership for the network, there was quite a jump around about July 2010, and I wondered if you knew why that was.
That's a good point. That was actually linked to face-to-face meetings. Okay. So the face-to-face meetings generated, you know, which again is the way I had that slide at the end, it actually generated the energy and brought more membership in.
Great, thank you. And my other one is about the open school, which I think is obviously fabulous. But it's my understanding is it's free to medical students, and I wondered if there was anything similar for non-medical students or people working in health, or whether there is likely to be for the open school.
So, Jessica, you can answer that question. There is a charge, because people started to use it to induct people into a hospital, for instance. So I have to say the charge is minimal and actually laughable in many ways, because it's more of a token to ensure that we can upkeep the page. Jessica, you can add to it, but I want to combine your question with a double answer here, which is a recent piece of news. The Eastern Virginia Medical School just made the open school certificate of completion mandatory for every medical school at the medical school, which is something that grew out of the chapter, who called up and said, guys, we need to reflect on this, and initially no chance, and then they heard them, and now it's mandatory. So
that's the thing for me, is that improvement, quality and patient safety improvement is everybody's business, not just the clinicians. I think is kind of.
Did everybody hear that?
Yeah, so I'll repeat the answer. I wasn't sure if you were asking just the profession. It's free for all professions, students. and faculty.
But you raise a good point, which I think has already, we've had conversations about, that half the doctors in our country are in training. They're out of medical school, but they're not yet in career posts. They're in junior doctor posts. And I think that's something that we do have to kind of think about looking forward, because they will be the workforce for the future around quality improvement.
And there's amazingly creative programs. Tricia leads one of them in terms of foundation doctors and so on. Brenda and Charlotte lead another one. So in the UK, I already know 6 or 7 who are working quality and safety at that level.
One last question, because I'm mindful that we don't want to erode tea time. So if you guys could be very quick, that would be great.
As a person who is not very familiar with the net, can you show us a few slides? How does this website look like? What is really done on the computer? Because all what was here now, it was just theory.
So
For the safe, maybe not of the IHI, because this I can find on the website without problem, but I would like to see anything concerning the safety.
The Safer Patients Network.
Yeah.
There is actually, if you actually Google the Health Foundation, there's information about the Safer Patient Network on that website. But it was actually a closed network, so it was actually only the organisations themselves that had the access to the platform. Okay.
So I think that website, Penny, I'm looking at you because I know you'll know it, is health.org.uk. Yes, www.health.org.uk. Penny, is your question very quick, or do you want to save it?
It's all right.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, thank you very much for that introduction. We have a presentation now from the University of Leicester. Graham Martin and Mary Dixon-Woods have put together over some period of time a lot of more academic work, but really interesting work about clinical networks. So I think this will be very complementary to our understanding, and I'm sure in 35 minutes we'll have even more questions to ask. And Graham, I think, is going to do the presentation, and then they'll both be available for questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Tricia. Is that audible? Yeah, good. Okay, I'll try not to stray too far from it. Wave at me if I do. So my name's Graham Martin. Thank you for coming along. Annette said you can't have a network without a net, which was a great little slogan. Unfortunately, I haven't got anything quite like that, although if the lunchboxes today and yesterday are anything to go by, you can't have an international forum without grey ham. So here I am. I hope I'll be a little bit more appetising. I'm here all week. Anyway, so Tricia said that she hoped there would be some interesting synergies between the presentation we've heard from Annette and from Pedro and the presentation that I'm going to give. And I think there will be quite a lot. I'll try to draw them out explicitly, although I think they'll be quite self-evident from a lot of the slides. So what I'm going to talk about is, I suppose, the third network that has some interesting differences, but also some interesting commonalities with the two networks that were discussed earlier on in the session. And again, this is another network or set of networks that was funded by the Health Foundation. I'll say a little bit more about them in a while, but they are essentially clinical communities is what they've been called. And they try really to build on a lot of the theory and growing empirical evidence base about what networks are good at, what their limitations are, what the challenges are, and how to overcome those challenges. And so very useful from that point of view. And we're just at the stage now where we've been responsible for the evaluation of these clinical communities. I'll say a bit more about that in a short while. And we're just coming to the end of that evaluation process. So these are emergent findings that I'll be presenting. Arising from that evaluation and also building on some of the theoretical work we did at the start. So what I want to do is I'll try my very best to keep it to under 30 minutes. Feel free to wave at me, Tricia, if I'm approaching that mark, so that there's plenty of time for dialogue at the end, because I think the most interesting things, especially in terms of learning and implications for trying to do something that looks like a clinical community in practice, will come from that dialogue and from the questions and potentially from the cross-comparisons between this presentation and the earlier one. So this is the format that the presentation will take. I'll be giving you a little bit of background on both quality improvement, not that you need to know anything about that, and the rationale for networks. I'll be focusing in on this notion of a clinical community and what distinguishes that both from other ways of organising to improve quality, but also from different kinds of networks as well. I'll then give you a brief bit of information on the Closing the Gap Through Clinical Communities programme funded by the Health Foundation and about the methods we used in evaluating that programme. And then finally I'll be giving you a number of points. They're far from exhaustive, but I think they're 5 of the most interesting areas of insight that have arisen from that evaluation around how to make clinical communities as effective as possible. So this is the grandmother to suck eggs slide, I'm afraid, so I won't dwell on it for too long. Okay, we all know that quality and safety are now central concerns for healthcare systems worldwide. That's taken as a given. That's why we're all here. And we all know equally that quality and safety are hard to do in practice. The literature is somewhat sporadic. Some areas of the literature are more scientific than others, but a frequent conclusion is that improving quality and safety is challenging and that something that works very well in one context may well flounder in another context. Some of the different approaches that we have as a community, as an industry, as a sector, to improving safety and quality in healthcare are listed at the bottom of the screen there. So, and the top 2 are perhaps the ones that, although you don't necessarily think of them purely in terms of quality and safety, are the ones that are used most frequently, or at least in the United Kingdom context, and I think it's fair to say in a number of other contexts as well. So you have bureaucratic hierarchical approaches, command and control, top-down efforts at change. The Department of Health or the Central Ministry, or indeed the payer says jump, the provider says how high. And it can be a very effective way of achieving improvements. So institutions like the National Institute for Health and Clinical Excellence in the United Kingdom will issue evidence-based standards in healthcare, and it is expected that all providers of healthcare meet those standards. And if they don't meet those standards, then there are consequences. There are market-style incentives as well. So again, particularly in systems that are dominated by the market. In the English system, for example, you have commissioners who buy care from providers, and they have ways of commissioning for quality. We have a system in England called Commissioning for Quality and Innovation, which specifically incentivizes particular standards and can improve the income of a provider organisation if those standards are met, and decrease the income if they're not met. So pretty brutal forms or ways of achieving change, but actually ones for which there is a good degree of evidence in certain circumstances. Also approaches which have their disadvantages. So in terms of the first one, for example, it's all very well setting a target or giving a performance measure that should be met, but it's perfectly possible that can have all sorts of unintended consequences. It may be that providers meet the target on paper, find a way of complying with it apparently, but then do everything they can, either intentionally or unintentionally, to avoid actual change in practice. So the apparent change on paper doesn't drive the substantive change that you're trying to achieve. Or alternatively, it becomes so overwhelming that providers or the people whose behaviour you're trying to change becomes tunnel visioned on that one standard to the detriment of everything else in a quality healthcare system that's important to maintaining that quality. Market-style incentives, similarly difficulties with possible perverse incentives, and also problems with knowledge sharing between different providers in a market, because suddenly you're setting these people up as competitors. Hospital A has a competitive advantage because it's learnt how to improve quality and is meeting all the requirements of commissioners. Where's the incentive to share that knowledge with Hospital B? There isn't one, because they're your competitor. You've got to stay away from them. So there are limitations to this. The third approach that I've listed there is specific quality improvement methodologies. Again, some evidence for their effectiveness, but on their own they can be sporadic, they can be dislocated from each other. It's very difficult to spread and sustain change from one particular initiative throughout a system. This gives rise to the suggestion that network-type approaches may be one possible answer. And there is a growing evidence base for networks. We've heard a little bit about it already. There's various examples of very different kinds of networks. And I was slightly worried when I saw the programme that the first session here might be telling me that some of these aren't networks. But fortunately, Annette and Pedro haven't yet told me that. Perhaps they'll come up with it at the end instead. But there's a number of different styles of network. Networks are not a single approach. And networks as a whole have advantages, but there's a lot of importance in how you do the network. In particular, there are two important but quite different risks when you're setting up a network and trying to make it functional and effective in changing behaviour and improving quality of care. On the one hand, there's some evidence from managed clinical networks in the United Kingdom of this happening in particular. You can have a sort of a managerialisation of the network. You've got a network form there, people are working together, they're cooperating, they're sharing knowledge, they're doing all the hand-holdy, motherhood and apple pie type stuff that networks should be doing, and the network becomes an instrument for performance management or for disseminating information from the centre to the periphery and all the kinds of ways of working, command and control that goes with that. So that's one risk at one extreme. The other extreme, of course, is that even though everyone likes the idea of a network, and in principle it seems like a really good way of harnessing professionals and patients and managers' intrinsic desire to improve the quality of services, because I think that's real, and again, I'm sure that many of you would agree with that. Despite its potential in doing that, it becomes marginalised because it's got to compete in a kind of a governance arena, if you like, where there are all these different things going on. There are all these command and control type things with sanctions and punishments and incentives that go with them, and everyone thinks it'd be great to participate in this network, but I've just not got time to do it because, frankly, I've got 101 other pressures which have much more worrying associations if I don't do what I'm meant to do. So networks have to tread this line between irrelevance and undermining the very soul of what a network is. And this, I think, is a real challenge for any form of networked form of trying to improve quality, or indeed trying to do anything else. How can you impel and propel and inspire improvement without resorting to approaches that undermine professionalism, but at the same time maintain relevance? This brings us on to this notion of the clinical community. So, as I say, and I'll say a little bit more about the programme specifically in a short while, clinical communities are a particular form of network. I'll say a little bit about the history of how the idea came about. The terminology comes particularly from the Health Foundation and its programme that we evaluated. But essentially what a clinical community is all about is trying to harness this professional ethic, this intrinsic desire of professionals, patients, managers, other practitioners, everyone with a common mission around improvement, trying to marshal that and harness it towards improvement. So it follows the form of a network in that its power comes from the links between these people, their sharing of knowledge, their mutual motivation, a little bit of peer pressure, a little bit of nudging here and there. But alongside that, they have a degree of compulsion. And Annette was talking, for example, about the needs to drive and coordinate and manage networks to some extent without overly bureaucratizing that. And I think that's what clinical communities are all about as well. So clinical communities have a core of people who take responsibility for the coordination, for the driving, for the leading, and occasionally, as we'll see, for a little bit of compelling and coercing. But the responsibility for making the changes is distributed across the members of the community. And I said the terminology comes from the Health Foundation, as does much of this thinking, and it comes from our evaluation as well. But perhaps the original or the prototypical clinical community is this one. I don't know if that's legible or not, but whether or not you can read it, you'll almost certainly know the study. The paper on the left is the New England Journal's paper that by Peter Pronovost and colleagues from Johns Hopkins, which describes the effects of the Michigan Keystone catheter-related bloodstream infection reduction program. So this was a program that sought to reduce bloodstream infections by using a variety of strategies, and at the core of that was a number of a care bundle of evidence-based standards that should be followed, but all around that was a community, and a number of communities in each of those hospitals that was participating, a collection of people working together to try to make the intervention go into practice through exactly these kinds of mechanisms. The paper on the right is more recent, and again, I think that is probably slightly more legible in the Milbank Quarterly, as you can see. And this was a paper that sought to understand and explain and account for why the Michigan Keystone program was so successful. So it was a study that was done jointly by two of my colleagues at Leicester, one who you were probably expecting to see here, but who will certainly be answering the questions in a little while. She's in the front row, Mary Dixon-Woods, and also Emma Louise Aveling. They worked with Charles Bosk, a sociologist from the University of Pennsylvania, and two of the people who were at the root of the Michigan Keystone Project, Peter Pronovost and Christine Goschel, to sort of retrospectively work out what it was about that program that was so effective across a number of contexts. And it was exactly these things around the network of individuals, the common purpose behind them, their agreement that there was a problem here and that they were responsible for improving that problem. But it was also about some of these slightly less obvious but very, very important things about networks. The fact that it incorporated both horizontal and vertical structures. So there was a bit of hierarchy in there. There was a bit of compulsion. There was a little bit of coercion at times. There was a lot of peer influence. There were social control mechanisms, so peer pressure, if you like. All of these things were going on. And it was this combination of factors that, not universally, but across many of these sites, resulted in improvement that was well evidenced and sustained through time. So this notion of clinical community is increasingly catching on. Will this work or won't it? That's not that problem. Oh, yeah, okay. So here we see Peter Pronovost again, who is now taking this approach and applying it to other quality and safety problems in the Johns Hopkins Medicine system of hospitals in Baltimore and in Maryland. I'm not able to... So I need to do this on this screen. Here we go. Mouse is a bit flaky. Okay, so really all about bringing people together as a clinical community, building on shared wisdom, organised, all of these kinds of notions. These slides, by the way, are available on the, I'm not sure exactly how you get to it, but I uploaded some handouts, and I presume there's a way of getting to them. I think you might have to go to the to rooms 201 and 202 to get copies of these. So if you would like any of this information, do that or do email me. It's Graham, that's Graham without the Y, .martin@le.ac.uk. So this is a notion that's gaining some currency and I think gaining some uptake around the world. I'm now not quite sure how to get rid of this. I've tried escape. Hang on, Alt tab. Yeah, that's right, I've got it. No, I haven't. Oh dear, right. Oh, there we go, it's all right. Panic over. It's just testing. Yeah, panic over, but I won't actually click on the other link there in case I'm not able to get back so quickly. I'll just hover over it so that you can... No, that's not much use at all. It's not a very useful link. That was just to say that there's also a paper that, again, links into the notion of what a clinical community is and builds on a wide range of social scientific literature to try and build a theory of why clinical communities should work. So that's available in the Journal of Health, Organisation and Management, this year's journal issue. But I'll be picking up on some of those theory-based ideas around what a clinical community should do and how it should do it in what I'll be talking about in just a minute around our evaluation of this, the Health Foundation's Closing the Gap Through Clinical Communities programme. So the Health Foundation obviously have a very big presence here, and I'm sure many of you already know that they fund a great deal of work in the United Kingdom and beyond, which tries to facilitate and demonstrate and support improving quality and safety in healthcare. A project, or rather a programme of projects that they introduced a few years ago was this one, Closing the Gap Through Clinical Communities. Clinical communities we've already talked about. Closing the gap meant trying to improve practice in areas where there was a deficiency, a shortfall in routine practice in a hospital or a region or indeed the whole country, and what we know to be best practice in terms of evidence-based standards or benchmarking with other systems in terms of mortality rates or complication rates or whatever else. So 11 projects were funded through this, each of which followed this clinical communities model broadly. Each had a core group leading and administering and coordinating, and then members across the participating organisations in a region or across a country. Communities, this is probably important to stress, the clinical community was the form, it was the structure for achieving this, but in terms of what they did and the methodologies they used, that was not prescribed. And different clinical communities involved in this programme used a range of different approaches, including, again, many of the ones that we've heard a great deal about here. So we were lucky enough to be commissioned to evaluate this programme, and we're still smiling now, even though our final report is due in next week. So it has been a very enjoyable one to evaluate. I won't say a great deal about the methods. I can, of course, answer questions about that. But very broadly, our evaluation was qualitative. It was looking at how these clinical communities work, what the challenges they face are, how to overcome those challenges, and so on. So we used a case study approach in which we sampled, on a theoretical basis, on a purposive basis, 3 of the 11 clinical communities. There's a few details about the 3 that we sampled there. I won't say any more than what you can read there, because I think those details aren't especially important. But what it does show is that these clinical communities were trying to do quite different things in terms of quality and safety in quite different clinical fields and primary care, secondary care, tertiary care across the health system and addressing different problems. So we collected a great deal of data across all 3 sites, much ethnographic work. I think that adds up to about 450 to 500 hours of observational work, both within those core teams who were leading the clinical communities and in the sites that were participating across the whole networks. Alongside that, we did interviews across those whole networks. Again, a great deal of interviews in each site. And sort of the third part of the triumvirate, we did a good deal of documentary analysis looking at the papers, plans, publicity materials, minutes, and so on that these projects produced. And we took a qualitative approach to analysis informed by the constant comparative method, which you may be familiar with, but which I won't go into a great deal of detail about right now. Do ask me if you want to know more. So I will just take the last 10 minutes or so to give you an overview of 5 of perhaps the most interesting findings. And as I said at the start, I think if there is interest and if there is utility to be derived from this study, it'll probably come out through questions, dialogue, questioning, challenge, and some of these may well seem very obvious to you, others of them may seem a bit odd, and you may even want to dispute some of them, but these are perhaps 5 of the things that seem most apparent to us in terms of the challenges and how to overcome those challenges in this kind of clinical community network. So I'll run through them one by one. Okay, Annette said something very interesting about connectors in a network. So as I say, you have a core team at the centre of these clinical communities, a number of participating organisations, each of which has a sort of a lead who signs them up to it. And as I said at the start, one of the apparently defining characteristics of a clinical community should be this shared commitment and shared responsibility. So anyone who was signing up to be a part of a clinical community was, in principle, saying, yes, I acknowledge there's a problem here, and I want to be a part of it. But that wasn't always the case. There were other reasons for getting involved in the clinical community. And even these people who were saying from a particular site, as the core teams went around the country and tried to recruit participants, even those who were saying, yeah, we want to be a part of this, in the end weren't necessarily as good connectors as they seemed to promise to be. There were problems in particular about whether the problem was real. And by that I mean perhaps not so much dispute about whether there was a problem in general about surgical mortality or readmission rates or compliance with evidence-based practice across the country, but whether that was actually a problem in this hospital. Because in this hospital, we're evidence-based, we're professional, we do everything right. And the second, the quotation in the orange box there in the middle really summarises what we got from all 3 of the sites around there's a, I've done this for the last 10 years, why should I change now kind of mentality. So everyone says mortality isn't low enough, but no one ever thinks it's their problem, if you know what I mean. And you've got to get people around to the idea that it's all our problem and not just someone else's. So this involved making a problem out of the problem, if you like. It involved making an issue into a problem that deserved attention and deserved action at a local level. And there were a number of strategies, and again, this is trying to be as practically useful as possible, but hopefully we'll pick up on some of this in discussion. There were some strategies that seemed to work well on this, and one of those was utilising good quality data that actually popped those bubbles of complacency, busted the myth that everything's okay around here and said, actually, look, you're not as good as you think you are, these are your data, and there does seem to be a problem in terms of the quality of the care you provide here. But alongside that, there was need for a great deal of discussion and negotiation among participants. And again, this was partly about avoiding falling into the trap of hierarchy. 5 minutes of that. Yeah, oh, thank you. It will be about that. Avoiding falling into the trap of hierarchy and command and control. And actually, in order to win hearts and minds, this had to be about saying, okay, we can see there's a problem. there's an outcome that we want to get to there, but we're not going to impose a solution on you. What we're going to do is provide you with support, with the knowledge of peers, with a little bit of pressure every now and again to find your own way to address that problem. Following on from that, maintaining momentum and making it clear whether or not progress had been made was another essential part of this. And I've heard this from a few of the presentations that I've been to here in an earlier conference, that this isn't always the case, that perhaps even baseline data aren't collected, and on an ongoing basis it's very difficult to monitor and to demonstrate and recognise progress if it has been made, but also to say, hang on a minute, there is still a problem here and you need to do more where progress hasn't been made. And data was absolutely core to the credibility of these clinical communities in keeping change going. And there were very shrewd ways in some of the clinical communities that we looked at of using that data to, again, just keep people on edge, avoid them getting back into that complacent bubble. So it might be that a hospital down the road is doing a little bit better, and that could be a very good spur. So it's not just about cooperation and collaboration, it's also about a little bit of competition, but knowing how to nurture and foster that competition and make it productive rather than destructive. And this leads into this point as well. I think, as I've said already, and I've probably laboured the point too much, intrinsic professional desire to improve is a big part of the particular advantage and value added of communities. But what these clinical communities found was that on its own, it wasn't enough. So there was lots of rhetoric about collaborative partnerships, not pointing the finger, sharing best practice. But in practice, because of these other pressures, the frenetic environment, the distractions that were all over the place, there was a need for something alongside that. And so slightly harder strategies were deployed by some of the clinical communities alongside these softer, nurturing ones. What do I mean by harder strategy? Well, the quote at the bottom there is a very good illustration of that. Being able to write a letter to the chief executive, invoke that managerial hierarchy and align with that managerial authority if necessary to get them on side and, if necessary, to put a bit of pressure from above on this surgeon who was enthusiastic at the start but who seemed to be becoming less enthusiastic. Quite often that was a latent threat, and it was more the knowledge that that kind of alternative strategy might be invoked that was enough to change behaviour. But occasionally you had to put that threat into practice to make it clear that it was more than just a threat. And again, building on that, what some of the communities did quite effectively was to find alignments with other aspects of other pressures within the healthcare system. So those managerial pressures, those priorities, those targets, those commissioning expectations, aligning with those at various levels from within the hospital, finding the right managers to get involved in the network who were absolutely crucial. This wasn't just about professionals and patients. It was about managers as well who knew the levers to pull and the language to speak. That was important. Coordinating with commissioners' agendas and aligning with national policies. So if there was a move towards quality improvements, then say, look, this is coming your way. And again, this quotation here is a very good example of that. The clinical community was used as, was one of the arguments made for joining this clinical community was, if we don't change ourselves through this collaborative, carefully thought out professional approach, then someone else is going to come along and impose things, and they're not going to do it in a medically sensitive way, in a clinically knowledgeable way. That's the alternative. This was risky. Sometimes, the community became too much aligned with those outside pressures, but it could be effective. 2 more slides. So finally, sustainability. Again, I think a preoccupation of many of the presentations at this conference, and it was difficult. And that quotation there, I won't read it out, but the top bit speaks of the enthusiasm of this participant at the start of it, and then the bottom bit is all about the practical challenges that came along and all the day-to-day slog that meant that enthusiasm dwindled ever so quickly. So maintaining that enthusiasm was difficult, and ongoing push was needed. And that meant doing a lot of the unsung, unheroic things, the background things, getting the administration right, coordinating, sending out newsletters, getting on the phone to people who hadn't provided data for a while, keeping things moving in quite an unglamorous way. This wasn't about the banner-waving leadership. This wasn't the inspiring. This is the slog that had to go on in the background. But it was absolutely crucial to sustain momentum through time. And there were efforts to try and shift responsibility for maintaining this change to the participants in the community, but those had mixed effectiveness. Okay, so 4 conclusions, really probably just reiterate what I've already said. So there is good theoretical and increasing empirical evidence for the benefits of networks, and we've heard plenty of that already. But networks don't run themselves. They're not a panacea, as Annette said. They're not something which you set them up and they run and sort everything out by themselves. They require a lot of active work, and they face considerable obstacles, especially around maintaining quality and competing with other pressures on people's time. But having said all that, clinical communities, from our evaluation, we would say look like a promising approach, an approach that needs constant adaptation, that needs further development, but which provides something to people who want to try to harness the collective will of practitioners, patients, managers and others towards improving quality. And I will leave it at that.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for questions. One question I just wanted to ask Mary and Graham was around whether there were any examples in the networks that they looked at where patients' stories, or indeed perhaps patients themselves, had been brought in during the network's sticky moments, when perhaps people were losing their vision as to why they had started the network and its purpose in the first instance.
Absolutely. So the structure that these clinical communities had was that they were mandated to have patient involvement. They weren't allowed to have a community that didn't have patient representation. The three communities adopted different models of patient representation, and these worked differently well. In all three cases, the patient story was absolutely critical to gaining the engagement of the participating sites, and in several instances it's actually very hard to see how the change would have happened without the patients insisting that this was what they wanted, that this was what defined quality for them, that it was about their experience. We also identified some lessons about how to involve patients in clinical communities, or indeed any kind of improvement work. Sending them to big meetings where they didn't have a clearly defined role and they were sitting at a table discussing the best type of defibrillator wasn't appropriate, but they were very, very good if what their role was clearly defined and what they had to say was valuable to the people who needed to listen.
Thank you.
So absolutely, these clinical communities do not happen without the patients being right there.
Thank you. Would you like to use the microphone to ask your question, and then everybody can hear? Thank you.
Ferzaneh Beiruzi. I just wanted to follow up. Could you give an example of what that might, one of those meetings?
Yes. So, in fact, one was a meeting about improving outcomes in surgery. And this type of surgery has variable mortality between different hospitals. Some hospitals do this surgery very well, and others, let's just say you wouldn't want to be treated there. And this clinical community was trying to get everybody up to the same standards. Now, one issue that confronted them was that some of the hospitals that had poor outcomes were basically picking the wrong candidates, and they were not having conversations where patients understood that they would be better off not having the surgery. And the patients were able to come into that conversation and discuss how it would be optimal to explain the risks and benefits associated with this sort of surgery in ways that would guide patients towards making better decisions, or basically guide the conversation between the surgeons and the patients, so they were able to come to a shared decision that was better for everybody. So that worked very, very well. It worked a lot less well when those patients were involved in technical discussions that would be boring for anyone unless they were they were actually a techie trying to do that thing.
You mentioned at the beginning that you had a number of different approaches in different areas, so some acute, some chronic. Were there any approaches that jumped out that you shouldn't use in the community that worked well in an acute hospital? Anything you can say on that?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that, but I'd say that speaking just towards the three communities that we included in our study, but I think this was reflected in several of the others as well. I think the ones that worked in hospitals had a somewhat easier task than the ones that worked in primary care of creating that community in the first place. I think that's partly UK specific because of the structure of primary care in the United Kingdom, and in particular the upheaval, which is covering the whole sector, but which is affecting the primary care sector in particular. But I think it's also possibly because of the greater existing networks between specialist clinicians and between generalists. So I think the ones that worked in primary care had a good deal more to do to make a success of a community and to create that density and quality of connections between the members.
Possibly it would be really about building on the potential communities that already exist there.
Possibly. I think something that one of the communities faced, a risk, if you like, was trying to balance between drawing on those existing communities, those existing connections, social ties and so on, whilst at the same time making sure that they were open to others who had something to give, and in particular those others might include patients, although often patients were included in the clinical networks, but managers perhaps. And there was a risk, I suppose, of making something a little bit cliquey or clicky, rather than, so you can see that this is sort of a tension between building on what's already there without excluding others who aren't part of what's already there.
Thank you. Another question at the back there?
My name is Michel Katz from the Netherlands. I was wondering, you explained that it took a lot of work to set up networks, but also maintaining them. My question is actually the networks we've seen and you describe, how are they financed and how do you think they should be financed actually?
Very good question.
I thought it was an easy question, and Mary said I could answer it, so it's definitely not. Okay, so the short answer is that they have been financed through some block funding from the Health Foundation to the tune of, I think, about £500,000 each over 2 years, although some of them have spread that out over slightly longer. That money also included training and development and various other things. In terms of how they are financing themselves on an ongoing basis, I think that varies. I think some of them, and this isn't necessarily very data-based because this is our most recent tranche of data collection, which I haven't really looked at, but so perhaps slightly anecdotally, but from memory, some of them see themselves as embedding in other existing clinical networks. Many of them saw a key part of their task as getting commissioners on side, and commissioners obviously have a great deal of power in this. Some of them are maintaining at least some roles that were originally financed through the Clinical Communities Programme, are maintaining those with funds from, for example, a professional society. So, does Penny have the answer here? No? Yeah?
I did want to add on something specifically
well, in that case,
on that point, but not...
Okay, well, I've more or less finished anyway. But yeah, to summarise, there are a range of models. But I think the fact that many of them are trying to fund the certain key administrative stroke coordinating roles on an ongoing basis speaks to the importance of those roles and the need for, the need not to assume that networks can just self-sustain, that they require active endeavour.
I did just want to add in...
Yes, no, of course, Penny. Do you want to just say why you're...
Okay. The Health Foundation is currently running a programme where we have involved a wide range of very, very different networks operating in healthcare in the UK. One of the key things that those networks are kind of flagging is that, particularly given the financial constraints, identifying different sources of funding that's sustainable is really challenging for a lot of them. Where I think there's a lot of potential is that we've got some networks that are very used to sort of top-down block funding. And we've got other networks that have never had any resources and need to use quite different network strengths to kind of tap into that resource. So I feel like actually there's an awful lot of learning that can go on between one type of network and another.
That's a great point, and I suppose with my sort of hospital executive hat on, perhaps it does beg the question that when you're building a network, you need to understand at the beginning how you measure its benefit, and if you can measure that in clinical outcomes or in some other cost-saving situation, even if it's to do with the spread and speed of spread of good practice, then that might be something to think about up front, because as sure as anything, one day you will have to justify some funding to support the connectivity, because I think it's fair to say that it needs something in the middle driving it, as well as that professional desire to be part of something that's bigger and better than just a small team of individuals in one location.
And that again speaks to the importance of robust and valid data collection.
Absolutely. Do you want to come back on that?
I've got a question in line with that a bit, actually the previous question, because you also said it's difficult to maintain a good quality of the network and find the right members. Would it be good to ask them to pay for joining the network? Maybe it could increase the quality of their membership. How do you feel about that?
There are examples of where you pay to play, and they seem to secure greater commitment because it's all the nudge stuff, isn't it? So you have to, even a small amount that you pay enhances the willingness of people to then derive the benefit from what they've paid for. But there are going to be organisations who can't afford to pay, or individuals who can't afford to pay. So there is a danger that you kind of create an effect where you're excluding rather than including. So it's not straightforward, and I think it's something we could do with better evidence on.
I suppose with that in mind, is there evidence from either of the presentations that it's actually the personal benefit that you get as an individual that drives your enthusiasm and commitment to the network? Because in a paying situation, the organisation might be paying, not you personally. But if you personally pay, you might have a different approach, but that might not be acceptable in a work environment. Whereas, I suppose, for a student joining a network, there might be a bonus. For an employee, they might feel that that's not a legitimate claim on their salary.
I think there are, I mean, I'd agree with that to some extent, and I think you would probably want to avoid giving the impression or giving rise to the situation whereby people were joining for personal benefit, and that might be a reason for organisational subscriptions. On the other hand, I think there are certain precedents for individual membership of organisations committed to improvement, and professional associations which hosted many of these clinical communities would be an obvious example of that. Your Royal Colleges or your Society of Specialists of one kind or another. Clearly a big part of their role is driving quality improvement, but of course they're professionally specific, whereas these communities were explicitly about crossing professional boundaries.
Thank you. Any more questions from the floor? Yes?
I've got one, but I think David over there has been
You were first,
long.
you were first,
Sorry.
James.
Was it?
You're
Okay.
obscured by the screen, I'm sorry.
So, just a question about patience. And it was, I mean, interesting and very good, obviously, to hear that they were part of the kind of requirements to play with the closing the gap. But I'd be interested in your or your observations on the patients' perceptions about these networks and the discussions that they had. And I guess, where I would start from, if I didn't have a medical background, but I was just a guy in the street, is I am shocked about, that this hospital might knowingly know that its results were considerably worse than the one down the street, but yet keep its doors open.
By just a quick clarification, by patients you mean the ones who were actively involved in these communities, or the patient?
I think I heard
at large?
Mary say that it was a requirement. That
Yes, the former. Yeah.
I don't think patients generally are aware of variations in quality.
No, sorry. No, it wasn't a question about... my question was, what did you in your evaluation observe, if anything, about the patient input, and what did the patients glean from the network?
Okay, so the patients who were involved as part of these communities, who were actively brought along, were, from the interviews that I've read, which I think is most of them, if not all of them, were overwhelmingly enthusiastic about the fact that here was a bunch of professionals who were committed to improvement. But what is important to remember is that these patients weren't in the main the kind of person that you mentioned, someone off the street without a prior interest, who's obviously, sees their GP and perhaps has been into hospital once or twice. In the main, these were patients who had had experience and often had had adverse experiences of care. So they knew that there was a problem out there. The wool, the wool had been pulled from their eyes. They were aware that, doctors aren't all heroes and saints and that things do go wrong. So what they saw in these communities were the good guys who were working to improve quality and change things. So they're, in terms of the actual participants in these networks who were from a patient background or who represented patients, overwhelmingly positive about it.
Thank you.
Very quickly, I mean, were they, I guess what I'm pushing at is, were they not surprised that this sort of stuff wasn't happening already? And I guess I'm just thinking about people who work in intensely competitive industries, where you often see competition, extreme competition within a firm, or indeed across different players within an industry, where even in that situation, people come together in service of their own better performance across competitive silos?
I think there's always a degree of astonishment at the way that an arcane institution that you've never come across before works on the inside. And I spoke to a lay member of my university's council who said exactly the same thing just lately, and he came from, a private sector background, consultancy, I think, and, was exposed to the vice-chancellor and the pro-vice-chancellor and all the deans, and said he couldn't believe how difficult it was to achieve change with, your average university professor. So I think there's always a certain amount of opening of the eyes when you come across a professionally dominated institution about how difficult it is to coordinate, to manage, to govern, to do all those kinds of things.
One last question. I'm sorry to have not seen you in the corner of my eye.
Given the time, I'm selecting a shorter question now. Have you had or did you see any experience within the networks you evaluated of them deciding to measure and report the extent to which people contributed to the network? So attendance at WebEx's, the fact that they were taking a distributed leadership role, or logging on to web pages, participation in, you get the point. But did you find that as evidencing a successful network or not?
I think there was variation cross-sectionally between our three sites, but I think what was more noticeable was the longitudinal increase in the acceptance towards and embracing of surveillance and monitoring what was going on, and a number of different ways of monitoring that, from process and outcomes data relating to clinical activity, but also the kinds of things you're talking about. Is this person coming along to a WebEx? When was the last time they emailed me? Are they providing their data regularly? And there was, through time, definitely an increasing, I suppose, resignation to the fact that this needed active management to keep people involved, and that it wasn't going to be their intrinsic motivation alone that drove participation.
But was it reported to all other members of the network?
Sorry,
that's really what I meant.
There were some examples.
Yeah.
So one of the projects, one of the clinical communities required completion of a national database that had been set up by the community, and they sort of sent naming and shaming emails, which showed which hospitals had the highest and which hospitals had the worst rates of completion in this database, and that shook things up.
Annette, I saw you nodding your head with a question. Do you just want to add one last point to that from your experience, and then we better close for tea?
We did actually measure the kind of things that you talked about, David, but there's a thin line between upsetting people. You're trying to engage people, and then you start this line between performance management and, so I think there's a thin line that you walk. But also, when you, in terms of measuring the outputs of networks, the literature, and I'm sure you'll agree with me, supports that it's very difficult to attribute results to a network because of the so many variations. So I think measurement is something that really needs to be considered. Turning up at a WebEx does not necessarily translate into activity and results. It means people just turn up and lurk. So thinking of those 4 L's, I'd leave you with that. Okay.
Thank you. Well, thank you everybody for a very interesting session, and hopefully everybody's inspired to go off and do even more research on the web about networks, and then next year we can have an even bigger debate. Thank you.